So there is this video going viral from a former British Army member, and it's got a really stark and controversial warning about the future of the UK. He's basically arguing the country's on the brink of tribal warfare. So in this explainer, we're going to break down his case slide by slide, just to understand exactly what he's claiming and why. Okay, so right at the heart of his whole argument is this really direct claim. He doesn't mince words at all. He's predicting a fundamental breakdown of social order, and he even suggests it could be worse than just unrest. And really, this one sentence sets the tone for everything else he's about to say. So where's all this coming from? Well, the speaker basically frames his whole argument as this warning he's been giving for years, a warning he feels has just been ignored and sneered at. He kind of sets himself up as the voice for, the ordinary decent man in the street, who in his view has just finally had enough of being told everything's fine. All right, so let's dive into the first part of his diagnosis. His whole point here is that Britain is facing this huge system-level crisis. And here's how he starts to build that case. So a huge part of his argument hinges on this idea that the social contract, it's just reaching a breaking point. You see, he suggests that the average person in Britain is pretty tolerant. They just want to get on with their life. But he claims that contract is now totally broken because the very system that's supposed to provide for their basic needs is in what he calls an existential crisis. And he gets really specific about what he sees as these failing pillars of the system. He points to the welfare state buckling, the NHS being a joke, housing being a nightmare, and crime going through the roof. And in his view, these aren't just, separate problems. They're all signs of this massive systemic failure that people are feeling every single day. And that brings us to one of his sharpest points, the one thing that was supposed to make it all worthwhile. What he calls the enrichment from diversity has, in his telling, completely failed to deliver. He calls it the biggest con job, which is, that's a really strong and provocative thing to say. Okay, so if the whole system is failing, who's to blame? Well, according to the speaker, that brings us to the next part of his argument, assigning that blame. He traces this entire crisis back to one single central policy, and that is what he calls the industrial-scale importation of people from cultures that, and this is his claim, have zero intention of integrating into British society. And to back this up, he gives a list of some pretty specific and, very highly charged examples. So he talks about laws being treated as optional, tolerance being seen as weakness, and then he points to things like grooming gangs, so-called no-go areas, and even Sharia patrols as evidence of this failure to integrate. He's also really critical of how the authorities have responded. From his perspective, instead of actually tackling these issues, the authorities are just in denial. He says they lecture the public about community cohesion, while basically blaming the native population for even raising these concerns. And this leads to what is really one of his biggest complaints, what he calls a two-tiered policing system. On one hand, he says you have the native Brits who get punished for protesting. And on the other hand, you've got what he calls imported mobs who, he argues, can burn flags and block streets with basically no consequences. And look, he doesn't just blame the people in charge now. He paints this as a political failure that's been going on for a whole generation. He accuses leaders from Tony Blair all the way to David Cameron of lying about immigration, and he lumps Keir Starmer in with what he sees as the exact same failed political class. So who exactly is this elite that he keeps talking about? Well, he breaks it down into these four main groups: open border zealots, cultural Marxists, spineless Tories, and labor ideologues. In his story, these are the people, the architects who've designed the policies that have led Britain right to this crisis point. Okay, so all of this leads to the final and honestly the most dramatic part of his whole argument, his prediction for the future. Where does he think this is all going? His whole argument really builds up to this one kind of chilling question. Is large-scale conflict in the UK now actually unavoidable? And his answer? It's completely unambiguous. Yeah, he's not saying this might happen. He's presenting it as a certainty. For him, the debate is over. The only questions left are when it will all kick off and just how bad it's going to be. He even lays out the kind of events that he thinks could be the spark that lights this whole powder keg. He's talking about things like another major grooming gang scandal, a big terrorist attack, or maybe a riot where the police are seen as failing to protect people. So, how does he justify all this talk of unrest? Well, his conclusion is almost philosophical.
He basically says that if a system stops protecting its own people and actually starts punishing them for complaining, then that system loses its legitimacy. It forfeits its right to demand obedience from them.
And he really tries to capture the feeling he's talking about with this quote. He really speaks to this feeling of being powerless, like a future was forced on people and now they have to face what he sees as the inevitable consequences.
So, in the end, after laying out this whole argument for why conflict is inevitable, the speaker finishes his video by asking, is there any way to actually avoid this? And after breaking down his entire case, that's the really provocative question he leaves hanging in the air.